Any discussion of detecting deception has to include focus, or at least a mention of the polygraph test. As I referenced in the Introduction to Psychology and Law, the polygraph has its origins by Dr. Marston with the overlap with Wonder Woman and her lasso of truth. The premise of the polygraph, as you may or may not be aware, is that lying causes physiological arousal. So when you lie, you tend to do certain things because you're physiologically aroused, and those things are listed here: increased heart rate, faster breathing, there's a rise in your blood pressure, and there's increased skin moisture, the galvanic skin response. So the polygraph is set up to measure these things, and while measuring, have a series of systematic questions that can gauge the degree to which you become physiologically aroused. And so the two common approaches, you have the relevant irrelevant question approach, and you have the control question test. So with the relevant irrelevant questions, you have three sets or three types of questions. There's a non-arousing question that's it's not relevant to behavior at all. So an example of that might be like, what day of the week is it? Or what is your name? You have a rousing question that's not relevant to behavior. So have you ever stolen? Have you ever lied to a family member? Things that will get some sort of physiological response probably. And then you have relevant questions that are especially arousing. Did you steal the money? Did you kill John Doe? And then what the examiner does is they compare the differences in physiological arousal to each of the three types of questions. And they should be the strongest to arousing and relevant if you're involved in a crime. One of the issues is that there's a high positive false rate, or high false positive rate, excuse me. And I have a really good example of this. The other Dr. Griffin actually wanted to go work at the FBI for I think it was a summer internship. And they went through and they were doing all the control questions, and she was answering those, and then they asked her a question and she was just kind of almost absent-mindedly answering the questions, and she said true or yes to one of the items that was essentially admitting to like conspiring with a foreign government or something like that. And she got all worked up and anxious because they're like, oh, really? Okay. And they started kind of asking her more. Well, she got very nervous. And for every question after that, she was just on edge and started getting more and more nervous, and she felt uncertain. And it resulted in her coming back and technically failing the polygraph test. So the control question test, what happens is you have known lies versus relevant questions. So you have like a control. Before 21, did you ever take something that did not belong to you? Have you ever done something dishonest? And then, innocent suspects should react more strongly to the control questions. If you're being dishonest in general, what's going to happen is you're going to not have quite as strong a response to those same control questions, where most people would say, yes, before 21, I have done something dishonest. The purpose of the control question test is you want to get them to lie about something so you can compare lies. Whereas when we're doing the relevant question, or relevant irrelevant questions, we're just trying to get them aroused, not necessarily lying about something. So that gives you a little bit of basis for what the polygraph is. Some of the weaknesses of the polygraph, the biggest one is, and I referenced this before, is there's a high false positive rate. I've actually seen research which says it's a little higher than even that, with the 16%. There's also these, the idiosyncratic emotional responses. You have psychopaths who have very little emotional response to some questioning. versus, as we would refer, nervous Nellies. People who are just anxious about everything, get nervous about everything, they would have over response. There's also the lack of standardization. There's a lot of variability in examiner training. The content of the questions, the control questions are set up prior, like there's oftentimes a bank of specific control questions, but circumstances of the crime could actually impact how those are interpreted. There's subjective scoring. What is a peak and a valley in the physiological response? And by that, I guess there's the graph that happens on the screen or on the sheet of paper, and how that's interpreted. It can be very subjective. Also, there's this possibility of deploying countermeasures. If you are familiar with what the polygraph is, there are things you can do to train yourself to be better. So, for example, control breathing at a steady pace, and control it during like control questions, and also you can make it go high wire by breathing funny or off with those control questions. You can the stereotypical one is you step on attack, and it causes pain, which alerts the physiological arousal. Ultimately, you can do things to elevate your arousal during control questions, suppress arousal during relevant questions, and these countermeasures can reduce detection of guilt by about 50%. So that's a pretty significant ability to even mask false reporting. So the research says that 77% of the time, guilty suspects correctly classified as guilty, and 70% of the time, innocent suspects are correctly classified as innocent. That's pretty darn good. And then 16% of innocent suspects incorrectly classified as guilty. I guess the other Dr. Griffin would fall into that boat with the FBI failure that she had. So it looks like it's pretty good. However, there's a couple caveats to that. One, these are carefully controlled conditions. It's not necessarily a polygraph being administered in a jail while there's all sorts of stuff going on around them. It's usually these research studies have most commonly been done in very controlled environments. Also, there's inflated accuracy rates, partly because of one, minimal consequences or rewards for successful lying. So there's less on the line. You're not trying to lie to get out of prison time necessarily or anything like that. And mock criminals have no training in the countermeasures. They just kind of come in and do what they think they should do if they're trying to lie. And the argument is that people who are more familiar with the legal system might have been educated a little bit more about how to try to deploy some of those countermeasures. And also this possibility I was mentioning before with people who are more likely toward on the spectrum of psychopathy, more further down the line, antisocial, they may have limited emotional arousal comparative to the people in these studies. So that brings us to an alternative, which I question, okay, is this an improvement to the polygraph? And it's called the guilty knowledge test. Still looking at physiological arousal, but now we're looking at it related to unique knowledge, so not lying. And this is based on research that shows that when people see information that they recognize, they tend to have a physiological response. And so we say, okay, multiple choice question, what was stolen? Was it a car? Was it jewelry? Was it money? Was it electronics, personal safe, or clothing? And if one of those stands out to you as what's consistent, unique knowledge, it's that's what was stolen, you would have a physiological response to that. And so if you had a physiological response to the one thing that was stolen out of the list, then that would suggest to them, yes, we kind of now know that you maybe know a little something about it. And then what weapon was used? Same basic principle. Let's say an axe was used. When you got through the list and you got to axe, one would expect there to be a physiological response to the word axe because you know an axe was used. So being knowledgeable about what actually happened in the crime, the guilty knowledge test. The research shows that the guilty knowledge test, it results in a reduction in false positive errors. There are some limitations. So first off is you have to usually have enough information about the crime withheld. So you can't let, like, if the media knows what happened and they publicize it all over, then a lot of different people will have this information. And also we need to make sure that the crime and details of the crime are well preserved. If there's any concern or question about what actually happened, then it skews our ability to tell from the physiological arousal. Also, the perpetrator has to have a good memory, and it's not just being smart, having a good memory in general. You have to have a good memory during the period of the crime. So at the time you commit a crime, a lot of times there's things like emotional arousal. You're rushed doing the crime. You're trying to get out of there. You're focused on other things. Maybe you use alcohol or drugs or whatever the case might be. And so you might not recall what the victim was wearing, or you might not recall whether you stole jewelry in addition to money. You might not remember all those details, and so you might not have the same consistent physiological response to that information. And another limitation that's pretty significant is you could be a bystander and have the same guilty knowledge as the perpetrator. And so, there are other reasons. I mean, you could be an officer who kind of went in there, or you could be somebody who a family member told you about it, or you might have heard rumors that something happened, like money was stolen and a gun was used. And then when those things pop up, you can go ahead and you'd have the physiological arousal to that. So there are certainly some things to watch out for.